Raj, a very warm welcome. Raj, a very warm welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can hear you loud and clear. And Raj, your new book is called Big Bets. We're talking this next 2 days about a very big challenge, and that is feeding 10 billion people by 2050. And I wonder if you could give us an insight about the kinds of big bets you reckon could approach this enormous challenge we're talking about.
Well, I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me. You know, I'm particularly appreciated our prior discussion on Washington Post Live, so I'm glad we get to do this together, Francis. And I also wanted to say hi to a few friends in the room, Angel Cabrera and Phil Lader, the former ambassador. If they are there, I can't see
They're
you.
Waving. They're waving to you.
Oh, good. So I feel like I'm amongst friends, and we can be quite open here, which is
absolutely.
Just really
and we
special.
have a wonderful online
I'm
audience
glad you're
too.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're tackling the challenge of food security and food insecurity. You know, if you look, the Rockefeller Foundation actually just today published a report that outlined 4 different scenarios for climate action on a global basis. And the business as usual scenario gets us effectively close to 3 degrees Celsius of warming, at which point, you know, you're going to have very significant downward pressure on food systems and on food production all across the planet, but particularly in vulnerable nations from a food security perspective. And if you have 30% reductions in yields in Africa and parts of India and Southeast Asia, in communities in Latin America, and even, frankly, especially in certain parts of the United States, you start to look at the numbers of people that will go hungry in the future skyrocketing. You know, I've worked on hunger with many of you for a long time. And in 1990, about 14% of the global population was hungry. We got that number down by 2015, 2016 to about 6%, 7% of the global population. And it's edged up a little bit because of the very inequitable response to the COVID crisis on a global basis. To today, it's 8 or 9%. But looking forward, the estimates are you'd have 1.4 billion people in a 10 billion person planet going hungry again. That's back to 1990 levels of global hunger. And that only touches on what true food insecurity is when it comes to the consequences of that. You know, in 2008, we saw a food crisis that pushed 100 million people into poverty, but it also caused 47 different episodes of political violence, unrest, and instability. We know that food security is national security, and we know how to address these challenges. The problem is we're not doing enough yet as a global community, and we don't really have the sense of urgency to do the global collective action efforts that are very much needed.
So Raj, I want to take you back to your book, Big Bets, and there's a very telling anecdote that we talked about before at the beginning of the book, where you were in India and you were handing out little millet balls, very nutritional little millet balls, and you realized you didn't have enough to go around. And I look back on that and think it was kind of an epiphany for you, but can you tell us a little bit more about why that meant so much to you?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for highlighting the book. The book is called Big Bets, How Large-Scale Change Really Happens. And I hope many of you will have a chance to read it. But I wrote the book because I feel like too often when we're tackling issues like food insecurity, we think of it as charitable work, and we therefore think doing a little bit of good is good enough. And I learned that myself when I was a young medical student spending a summer volunteering really with a very special NGO leader named Dr. Sudarshan, who had really his quality of life to go live in a rainforest with a tribal community in southern India, going door to door to take care of families and kids. And what he saw was 60, 70% of the kids were malnourished. So he would invite them to come to the central feeding camp where we were all living and working, and feed them a high nutrition diet, but in local foods. And this was a millet kind of ball, a grain ball that was covered in a curry of some type. in different curries, and it would quickly resuscitate these kids. And so over 2 to 3 weeks, they could then go back home and be much more stable in terms of their condition and their ability to withstand disease. And I was inspired by his action, but then I said, look, this was 1993 or 4, maybe 95, and you look around the world and you say there are 800 million people in this condition, and we're going door to door, kind of feeding one kid at a time. What are the types of solutions that really scale? And I learned how to think that way early in my career because I ended up, through one circumstance after another, working for Bill and Melinda Gates when they started their foundation. And to Bill's great credit, a lot of their analytic and intellectual focus was putting rigor to the task of identifying which types of solutions would scale and how could you actually solve global problems at scale as opposed to just doing a little bit of charitable good here and there. And so in the book, I talk about an effort to immunize every child on the planet that had some challenges in the front end, but over 2 decades has led to 980 million kids being vaccinated and 16 million child lives being saved. I talk about President Obama's big bet to confront the 2008 food, fuel, and financial crisis with a concerted global effort to reinvest in agriculture and resilient agriculture, a big topic of your meeting, in countries around the world. And over time, that effort with our partners lifted 100 million people out of poverty and hunger, not by giving out food, but by changing the tools they had at their disposal to lift themselves up and protect their own communities. And I talk about the big bets we're making at the Rockefeller Foundation, most recently to reach 1 billion people who live in energy poverty with renewable energy solutions that for the first time make it commercially viable in local currency terms to do so. So I wrote the book because I hope people, and I think your meeting exemplifies this, I hope people are realistic about being optimistic about tackling these issues in the future.
So Raj, in the book, and actually when we talked before, you mentioned the Feed the Future program, which was something you did, I think, at USAID. Can you tell me how that was structured and how it changed the equation around feeding people looking ahead?
Sure. Well, I'm sure many in the room will remember that after 2008, there was this extraordinary food crisis that was caused by a variety of different challenges. But as a result, The Economist, 1 month that year, put on its cover a picture of a young girl in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, eating a mud cake. And a mud cake is exactly what it sounds like. It's grain literally mixed with mud to improve the satiety effect of consuming it. And children across the world, in certain circumstances, were doing so. And it just seems pretty basic that we don't have to live that way. And we learned very quickly that if you force communities to live that way, you will deal with strife and instability and ultimately conflict and migration in a much more costly, much more dangerous manner shortly thereafter. So President Obama, at his very first G20 meeting in L'Aquila, Italy, put together a global coalition to reinvest in agriculture as a tool for addressing food security in a sustainable way. We built collaborations with universities, with nation states around the world, with innovators and technologists to put in place everything from renewed investments in resilient crops to putting in place digital technology that would help farmers gain access to extension services and farm level knowledge that would help them improve their production, to working with governments to liberalize agricultural trading restrictions and regulations so that trade wouldn't impede the effort to reduce food insecurity on a global basis. And that effort over time proved highly successful and ultimately became codified in a program called the Global Food Security Act, passed on a bipartisan basis by the United States Congress and reauthorized twice since then, including once under.
Well, Raj, I don't know if you can hear me, but we've lost your sound. So.
Red Sea Grain Initiative, which was negotiated by the United Nations between Russia and Ukraine to help feed communities at risk.
You just mentioned Ukraine. We lost sound just briefly then, but I wanted to ask you another topic that comes up in your book, and that's prioritization. And we're sitting here talking about this huge challenge of feeding people 10 billion by 2050, and at the same time talking about current challenges. The next person we'll be speaking to is actually talking to us from Egypt, where he's gone to help address the response in Gaza. So how do you advise, or how do you think about what to put first, how to manage these enormous problems that are both contemporaneous and urgent and distant and mounting?
Well, it's a great question, and maybe my time in politics affects the answer. But
Right.
I wrote the book Big Bets, and it covers some urgent humanitarian moments like the Haiti earthquake or the Ebola crisis in 2014 that required immediate focus and immediate action. And it also covers efforts like that immunization effort, which was really a 20-year program that's still very much ongoing. And what I've learned from that is the following, is that crises are in fact the opportunity to get people to pay attention and focus on kind of simple solutions that can have outsized long-term impacts. So we did leverage and use the 2008 food and financial crisis to galvanize political support for a reinvestment in global food security that then took place for 10, 12 years after the fact. And at least in politics, using those crises effectively to put in place those long-term programs is what's really important. I think too often we use the crisis to just address the crisis itself and not invest in the long-term solution. One example of that is pandemic prevention, where we had opportunities after Ebola, after Zika, after H1N1, after SARS, to put in place global surveillance systems. We never did so as a global community, and as a result, we really suffered through COVID-19. So use the crisis as an opportunity to make the long-term investments that can prevent these types of crises from the first place. And that takes some real forward thinking, and I'm sure you have the talent around the table to do that forward thinking today.
So you've talked about your experience at USAID and then the Gates Foundation, and obviously now you're leading the Rockefeller Foundation. So huge organizations. It makes me ask a couple of other questions. We've got people here who are involved in private investment. What's the balance? So government, public funds, philanthropic funds, private funds, how do we work together to advance these huge challenges?
Well, that's a great question because, philanthropy on these types of issues is actually quite small. Global total philanthropy is maybe $800 billion. Almost all of that is people giving to their universities or local cultural entities, which is a wonderful thing to do. But the kind of global focused investments from philanthropy in issues like food security or global development or poverty and inequality is probably 10 to $12 billion of that 800 billion, and almost all of that comes from 5 or 6 major institutions. So it's actually a fairly small component of investment. On a comparative basis, public developmental assistance in its various forms, which includes climate financing, is somewhere between 130 and 160 billion dollars a year. Also not anywhere near the scale of investment needed, but much bigger than philanthropy. So my advice is that philanthropy and philanthropic resources should actually be society's risk capital. It should be the kind of money that's out there doing highest risk things, building the unique coalitions of unlikely partners, often public and private, that are sometimes hard for public governments to do. And then frankly, working with government to take ideas and innovations and collaborations to meaningful scale. That's effectively how we operate at the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's what we call big bets, which are those kinds of efforts to build large-scale alliances, often instigated by innovators, risk takers, and sometimes that's philanthropy, but ultimately scaled through governments and through large-scale private sector collaboration.
So I'm going to open the questions to the room in a minute, but there's one thing that strikes me every time I've spoken with you, and that is about your general sense of optimism. And it's a topic that's come up already this morning about how to approach these big ideas. And tell us a little bit about, is that a personal trait of yours, or does it come from your experience of tackling some of these enormous challenges in health around the world?
Oh, I think it's all of the above. I'm from a family that came from India to the United States without a lot of resources, but with a lot of hope and optimism and a belief in America as a place of opportunity. I've been in roles in government and philanthropy in the private sector where I'm surrounded by people that present to me ideas that can help serve vulnerable communities at scale. And I see their enthusiasm for those ideas and their passion and their knowledge, and I cannot help but be inspired. And frankly, and I wrote the book because of this, whether it's through successes or even some failures, which I write about in the book, I feel like I've learned enough about how to build large-scale alliances to tackle some of these big challenges that I just feel it's possible. So for me, it's fairly easy to be optimistic, and I really believe it. And I'll give you one example. Just in the last 6 weeks, one of our grantees, a group called Digital Green, which helps farmers in India get access to information that helps improve their productivity and their incomes, was able to collaborate with Rockefeller, OpenAI, and some other partners, and in almost 6 weeks' time, built an artificial intelligence tool that helps farmers diagnose different types of pest and disease pressures on their crops, and very quickly provides them instantaneously with what they need to do to address that kind of concern with their crop production based on just looking at a couple of photographs a farmer will submit into the system. That kind of a solution can scale to millions of farmers in India relatively quickly, and can effectively replace the need we would have had 20, 30 years ago to train and deploy thousands of farm extension officials to go do that in the public service. So, every day I get to see solutions like that should make it possible for us to innovate our way out of the crisis we face in global food security. The question is, are we really doing it at scale? Are we coming together to search for those innovations? And are we investing at the right level of investment given how important of an issue this is for our planet?
I'm going to open to the room now. If anybody has questions for Raj, please. Your friend Angel is raising his hand right now, so
Raj,
it's going to be a difficult one, we can be sure.
Oh, good. Hi,
yeah, here comes the tough one. Thank you so much for making time for us, and I think your book and the concepts strikes just the right tone. You're exactly right for this room. Since we're talking about food, and you gave this last example, which was a great one, what are the other, among the entrepreneurs, innovators that you encounter through the foundation work, what are the technologies that you think may hold the biggest promise to deal with the challenge of feeding 10 billion people, dealing with climate change and the loss of biodiversity?
Well, Anil, first, I love what you're doing at the university to kind of instill a spirit of technology and innovation for the purpose of tackling these huge global challenges we face. On food and food technology in particular, I think the single biggest area of investment that's needed is a strategy to rethink how the world produces enough protein for reaching 10 billion people and serving their protein needs. And when you do the math, protein is not, it's a little bit like power. Protein and power are the two things as communities go from $2, $3, $4 a day in per capita income to $10, $20, $30 a day in per capita income. The two things they consume far in excess of their income growth is protein and power. And so, meaning electricity. And so, we have to decide how a world of 10 billion people will consume enough protein in the future. And if it's using the systems, technologies, and allocations to livestock we have today, we will destroy our planet. I mean, it's just that simple. And so that's a broad answer, Angel, because some of the answer is ensuring that we switch to protein-rich grains as opposed to relying on the opposite. Some of the answer is inventing staple crops that have higher protein content. Some of the answer, one of our foundation projects called the Periodic Table of Food, is really understanding the 20,000 core elements of food and which biochemical compositions give you more yield in terms of nutrition. Not every protein in every plant or every animal is consumed and absorbed in the same ratio and same manner. And then a big part of it, I think, is looking at real alternative proteins and reinvesting in making legumes and other high protein sources more appealing, more attractive, more efficient from an economic perspective. So doing all that is not just the task of technologists, it is also the task of policymakers, those that shape our subsidy and crop insurance and sustainable food financial incentives. But that to me is the biggest one. The other ones I think are probably well known to everybody, which is water use efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency for pretty obvious reasons. But I think sometimes we undervalue the focus we need to have on the protein question, and we overvalue discussions of how to tweak the current kind of monocropping culture around corn and wheat to be a little bit more water efficient, a little bit more nutrient and nitrogen efficient, and think that's the answer. That's not the answer.
We have any more questions? Yeah, Phil Lader, another of your old friends.
Hey, Phil.
A tough one. We're witnessing protests in the street here in Spain regarding the recent election. And you've made the point in your book and in your comments just now how these highly meritorious and very necessary initiatives need to be scaled up. As you're well aware, we've got 50 elections, national elections coming up next year. And looking at recent elections, whether it's Chile or Netherlands or elsewhere, there's a trend towards autocratic leadership and far right, I don't mean it in a judgmental sense, but far right inclinations of the electorates. How do you, using the fulcrum of the Rockefeller Foundation, go about encouraging many newly elected national leaders to follow the lead of the investments that the Rockefeller Foundation under your leadership's been making, when frankly many of their campaigns are speaking very much to a contrary song?
Yeah. Well, Phil, as expected, it's both a great question and one that is tough to answer. But I'd say the following, and maybe I'll give you three components of an answer. The first is, I do think we have to use the right language and focus on what really matters. I was just on Fox talking about President Biden's visit today to a wind turbine manufacturer in Colorado. And, the message he has to communicate is not one of global climate transition, but rather one of the 850 jobs that project will create in Pueblo, Colorado, and how those jobs, if they are genuinely uplifting to working families from all communities in that area, can transform Pueblo. And we find, whether we're doing work in the United States or in South Africa, where we decommissioned a coal plant and built out renewable electrification on the backs of it, or India, where we work with millions of farmers who teeter on the edge of viability and are so embedded in the politics of that nation, if you don't talk to people about what's right in front of them in terms of their opportunities for themselves and their hope for their children, you can't really get them to a place where you're working on climate resilient crops at scale in a meaningful way. So you got to meet people where they are and make this whole mission about jobs, about nutrition, about serving families, about giving kids opportunity. Like, I did that whole thing on protein. I wouldn't be out there talking about protein as a climate play. I would be out there talking about how do you ensure adequate nutrition, prevent your kids from being obese in the United States, prevent your family members from having amputations. We did 140,000 amputations due to diabetes alone in the United States, more than all of the wars our country's been involved with since World War II. It just, we need to talk about these things in a way that's much more.
Raj, I don't know if you can hear. We've lost sound again.
and I write about in the book, which is we have to build deep personal relationships across these political divides. There's just no way around it. And we passed the Global Food Security Act I mentioned because of relationships I was able to build, genuine ones with Jim Inhofe and John Bozeman and Johnny Isaacson, who has since passed, conservative Republican faith-based senators who did not believe in climate change, but who cared about the humanitarian concerns of children going hungry in Africa. And Jim and I traveled together, sat on farms together, talked to farmers together. And he's someone who carried a snowball onto the floor of the United States Senate to highlight that climate change wasn't real. But when you talk to Ethiopian farmers with him, and they said it's hotter and it's drier and we're starving, he led passage of the Global Food Security Act. We just need to get our politics kind of off of cable news and into the spirit of getting to know people personally and understanding where there's some alignment across party lines so we can get more done. And the third and final one, and I'm sorry to go on so long on this, I think it's just such an important topic, is I have found peer pressure still works in the global head of state community. So at Rockefeller, we supported President Macron to do this climate summit in Paris in June. We put together the climate summit for African leaders with President Ruto in Kenya in September. We created a whole initiative around reforms to the multilateral architecture and got a series of heads of state, including Modi in India and Motley in Barbados, to kind of chair that. And I found that even with some exceptions, but more often than not, if you can create venues where people come together as peers and force responsible conversation, it's chipping away at a problem, but you can make progress even with challenging leadership. So these are not perfect answers, Phil, because I don't have perfect answers on this tough question, but those are the things we try to do to make a difference, even when the politics feel so broken.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions around? I have is there a hand down there? I have a question about, you mentioned water efficiency, and it's a topic we've talked about this morning, and I'm wondering what kinds of innovations you're seeing or new approaches that can transform our ability to keep growing crops when at one moment we're in drought and the next moment we seem to be flooded in many parts of the world that are generally crop-producing areas.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think honestly the answer is as much dependent on soil and soil quality and our understanding of soil quality as it is on maybe the sexier and more technologically glamorous solutions around water efficient crop genetics or even drip and micro irrigation systems. I think a lot of water use efficiency over time is understanding how to improve soil health in the basic production of all crops and how to switch to crops that have characteristics that are naturally more nutritious and more resource use efficient in their production. And, for 100+ years, we have invested, this is an exaggeration, but almost all of our global agricultural research on 3 or 4 major global staple crops. And, that's a really reductive way to think about how to feed a global community of 10 billion people. And we should be much more diversified, creative, and holistic in our approach. And I think that starts with soil. And that can then be part of an answer to water and part of an answer to nitrogen in terms of resource use efficiency.
You're singing our song. These are the very topics we've been talking about this morning. And Raj, I don't know if you want to have one last word, but we soon need to let you go and to move on. So a last word to you if you want to. But thank you so much.
Well, I do. Well, yeah. Thank you, Francis, for having me. And I will just do this. It's a little self-promotional, but this is the book, Big Bets. I hope you can see it. Raj,
I have a copy, but I didn't carry it to Madrid. Great. Thank you so much.
But any advice or support in getting the word out. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye.